Hello there, and welcome to this video on the AGT series of rifles. In this video we're going to be showing you how to install and zero a scope. The rifle that we're working on today is the AGT Vulcan 3, however the information in this video will also be relevant to the Uragan 2 and the Vixen. All three rifles use a Picatinny scope mount at the top here, so the mounting procedure for all three guns is going to be practically identical. The scope rings that we're going to be installing onto this rifle are the UTG Pro 34mm mounts, so just these two here. The 34mm references this hole here, and this has to match the diameter of your scope tube. So the scope that we're going to be installing onto this rifle is the Delta Striker, which is a 5 to 50 magnification scope with a 34mm tube. That diameter there references the diameter of this part of the scope, so your scope rings need to match this diameter. The three most common scope tube diameters are 1 inch, 30mm and 34. However, that information will be available to you when you buy your scope, and you just need to make sure that the rings will suit your scope when you buy it. The other thing to make sure of is that you buy Picatinny scope rings rather than dovetail ones. With that all out of the way, we can begin on the job. Now, typically speaking, I like mounting my scopes at a range. That way I can properly look through them and get them exactly where I need them to be. However, for the purpose of this video, I'm just going to be doing it on the bench, but I'll try and explain exactly what I would normally do as we walk through the process. The first thing we need to do is install our scope mounts. Now, I've already taken the top caps off, although there is one thing I will mention in regards to this, and that is try and keep the scope caps aligned with their respective bottom pieces. Ideally, you would keep the top caps aligned and paired with their respective mounts. In other words, you put them on in exactly the same way you took them off. With that said, we can get these mounts mounted. Now, if you've never mounted a scope onto a rifle before, this is all going to be a bit of a guessing game, as you're probably not going to know what goes where or anything like that. But the best advice I can give you is just play around with things, experiment, and find out what works best for you. The first time you do it is probably going to take you a good half hour or so to get everything set up. But once you do your next one, it's going to be 10 times faster. I personally know from experience that this scope mount here needs to go roughly in this area here. And what I'm going to do is align this peg here with this third groove in the Picatinny rail on the top there. So just like so. With that in position, we can get the screw clamp done up nice and tight. We're going to do a similar thing for mount number 2. Again, aligning this peg here with this third cutout in front of this hump here. 1, 2, 3. Going to put our mount there. Next, we can bring back our scope and make sure that we can actually get the scope in where it needs to be. Ideally, you should have a bit of room to go backwards and forwards with the scope, which we have here. The next thing I'm going to do is get the rifle stood up and leveled. To do that, I'm just going to be using my bipod. And then we'll be sticking a shooting bag under the back. At this stage, we can give the caps a little wipe to make sure that there's no debris inside these mounts here. So I'm happy there. Then we can come back over with our scope and get that dropped into position. At this stage, I'm just going to get one of these caps installed so that if the worst should happen, the scope will hopefully stay with the rifle. With that done, the next thing we need to do is set our eye relief. So the eye relief is the distance between the end of the scope here and our eyeball. Typically speaking, it's between 2 to 4 inches, but that will depend on your scope and your set of eyes. There are also scopes out there which have 0 eye relief, and what this means is that your eye is pressed right up against the scope, hence the name 0 eye relief. As I said when we started this job, I normally typically do this at a range. So what I would do now is sit behind the rifle, pull the rifle into my shooting position, then adjust the position of the scope until I got the correct eye relief. The correct eye relief is when the scope picture takes up the entire reticle. If you're too close to your scope, you'll be seeing the image through sort of a pinhole. As you move your head closer and further away from the rear of the scope, you should be able to tell when you get into the correct position. You can always fine-tune your scope position as you're shooting, and typically speaking, when you get comfortable with your rifle, you're going to find the most comfortable shooting position anyway, so your head position may slightly move. Again, this all comes with experience, and the first scope you mount is going to take you absolutely ages, but the second and third will be much faster. Now, because I've already mounted this scope on this rifle before, I know that my scope's pretty much in the right position. However, if you can't get your correct eye relief, you may just have to move the scope mounts up or down the Picatinny rail. But again, this is just all personal adjustment. It's nice and easy to do while you're down the range, and once you get the hang of it, it's actually a process that's fairly enjoyable. Once we've got our scope set to where we want it, we can bring over our other top cap and get that done up. We're not going to be doing this up tight for now, we're just going to be getting the cap installed along with the screws for the other cap. The next step is to set the scope to level. Now, I would normally just install my level on the Picatinny rail itself, but you're not going to be able to see that with the scope in the way, so what I've got here is just a parallel. That just allows me to bring the level out just a little bit. So hopefully you can see that from there, but the scope, or the rifle I should say, is perfectly level. We can then put our level on our scope cap and then set our scope to level. So hopefully you can see that, but that looks pretty good to me there. Getting your scope and rifle nice and level is important, because as you start holding over or dialing your turrets, you want everything to go up and down nice and evenly. If the scope is off to one side, when you put in some elevation, the actual crosshairs won't go straight up, they'll go straight up and off to one side. So setting the rifle and the scope level is fairly important. But once we're happy and everything is level, we can do up these scope caps, doing them up nice and evenly. And as you do those up, just feel the caps themselves. The scope caps won't do up tight when you tighten the two halves. There'll be a small gap between them. This gap should be even on both sides, so just be aware of that as you tighten down the screws. Another thing to watch out for is that you're tightening onto the tube itself and not any tapered sections. So as you can see here, this front cap is tight to the taper. However, it's still on the parallel section of tube, so we're safe to do it up nice and tightly. At this point, for a real rifle, what you would do now is just go round these bolts and tighten everything to the correct torque. However, for an air rifle, I don't think that's necessary. So what I do is I just tighten up the bolts so that they're nice and tight, and I haven't had a scope move on me yet. However, if you want to use a torque wrench and torque your bolts up, now is the time. And then when everything's nice and tight, we can throw back on our level and make sure everything's still exactly where we want it. So that looks good to my eye, I'm happy. Before I take you down range, I just wanted to go through a couple of the adjustments on the scope itself. Now the first one that I want to talk about is the diopter adjustment, which is this one at the back. On this scope, it's a separate ring. However, on other scopes, this whole back piece here may rotate. When in doubt, consult your scope manual. This adjustment here is used for focusing the crosshairs of the scope. Typically speaking, what you will do is you will take the scope out into the open air, you'll look at the clouds, and you'll adjust this until you get the crosshairs perfectly pin sharp. You're not worried about the scope picture, you're just interested in the scope crosshairs. Once you have your crosshairs focused, then you can worry about the scope picture. To adjust the focus of the scope picture, you use the parallax wheel. On this scope, it's on the side here, although on other scopes, it's at the end of the scope tube itself. And on this particular scope, these markings here reference the yardage. So if we're shooting at 40 yards, we adjust the parallax to 40 yards like so, and then the scope picture should be in focus. If we're shooting at 20 yards, we turn the scope wheel round, and again, the scope picture should be in focus. Again, consult your scope manual if you've got any confusions about this topic. With that all said and done, we've got the rifle taken down to our range, and we're beginning the zero-in process. To start off with, I've got a large shoot and see stuck onto a large piece of cardboard, and we're just going to be putting that out at 20 yards. As you can see here, I've got a view of my crosshairs, and as we take a shot, you can see that the pellet appears at the top right. So it's nice and easy to see on a shoot and see. However, what we need to do is adjust the scope to match the point of impact. Typically speaking, on most scopes, the markings on the turrets will refer to pellet impact, not crosshair position. So in other words, our impact was high and right. We need to turn the turrets down and left. On this particular scope, that's clockwise for the windage and clockwise for the elevation. So in other words, we're moving the pellet down and left to match up with the crosshairs. Once we've made a small adjustment, we can reshoot the rifle and check our point of impact once more. At this stage, it's just a case of continually adjusting the turrets until we get the point of impact directly on the crosshairs. The only other thing that I'll mention in regards to this process is that some scopes will have locking mechanisms on the turrets. On this particular scope, to adjust the turrets, you need to lift them up before you can turn them. But again, consult your scope manual before you adjust your crosshairs. As we get closer, we're making smaller and smaller adjustments until we get the point of impact right on top of our crosshairs. With that done, we can do a quick 5-shot group just to make sure our point of impact is consistent. And as you can see here, the pellets are pretty much going through the same hole. Right then, with that all said and done, I hope that's given you some idea on how to install and zero your scope. The last thing we'll do in this video is just go over some troubleshooting tips, as well as giving you some more information on the mounts. So a very common problem that you may run into when zeroing your scope is the fact that you can't get the pellet strike to match the crosshair position. This is especially common on scopes with a small amount of internal adjustment. An example of this would be that your pellet strike is still high even though you've maxed out your internal adjustment. In other words, your crosshairs are roughly here and the pellet strike is up here. If that happens to you, what you may have to end up doing is moving over to adjustable mounts. So these are the Element Optics adjustable mounts, and with the clamp screw in the side there, you can see that you can move the position of the mount. What this allows you to do is angle your scope and get it in the correct position to allow you to zero your rifle. In our previous example, we mentioned that our pellet strike was still high. If you had adjustable mounts, all you would need to do is loosen the clamp screws, lift the front up by a small amount, then retighten the screws. You could then readjust your scope and you should be able to get the crosshairs exactly on zero. Another thing that I'll mention is that some zero eye relief and night vision scopes can't be set up using traditional mounts. They have to be mounted using their own specific mounting options. Typically, these are reach-back mounts, and they just allow you to get the scope exactly where it needs to be. Lastly, I just want to talk about some mounting options in regards to the scope mounts. Various different height scope mounts are available, so these two here are Vortex Extra High mounts, and they mount the scope a lot higher up than standard mounts. If you find yourself struggling to get a good cheek weld on the rifle, most of the time it just comes down to your scope height. So if you find yourself struggling to get your head low enough in relation to your scope, it may be worth investing in some high or extra high scope rings. Similarly, if you're floating above your cheek piece, you could probably go for some lower scope rings. The only thing that you need to be aware of is the distance between your scope and the shroud of the rifle. but as long as you have a little bit of clearance between the shroud and the scope, that should be good enough. With that all said and done, that's pretty much going to do it for this particular video. So thank you very much for watching. I hope it's been useful, and we'll see you in the next one.